Okay, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on teaching math courses online with group work. Our speaker for today's webinar are Professor John Anderson and Professor Max Aeschbacher from the Utah Valley University. Today, John and Max will discuss strategies to keep the students engaged in an online environment, and they will also share specific examples of projects that they've had used in their own courses. We're excited that they're able to share their vast experience and insight with us today. And if you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to enter those into the chat box at the time, and then we will address them at the end of the talk. We can also respond via email after the presentation if we happen to run out of time for the questions as well. And on that note, I'll hand it over to our presenters.
Hello, everyone. We're excited to be here and to talk with all of you about this. I do think I want to make one question / clarification, Sarah. I believe they're supposed to type questions into the question and answer box, not the chat box. Is that correct? So.
Yes, sorry about that. In the Q&A box would be fantastic. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And so as mentioned, my name's John Anderson and Max is here presenting with me, and we're going to kind of tag team this presentation back and forth as we go. So you'll hear us talk to each other a little bit. But we wanted to talk a lot about using group work inside of online math courses as a way to help engage students and help them not only in the content, but with each other and with the community that they find themselves, that learning community that they find themselves with. So wanted to give you a little bit of background about Utah Valley University, where we're at. You can see here one of our photos with the mountains in the background. And we're a regional state university, meaning we mostly offer bachelor programs and a few masters here and there. And our last official head count, we have 41,728 students that were registered for college classes at our campus. That does include regional campuses as well as our main campus in Orem, Utah.
And I believe our enrollment for the fall is even higher.
Yeah, we have more enrollment this fall than we did last fall at the moment. Of course, our classes don't start till Monday, so we'll see what actually happens with all of that, but it is interesting times for sure.
Yep. All right, so we wanted to talk in the context of our quantitative reasoning course, and so we'll give a brief introduction to that, and then we'll go from there. So our quantitative reasoning course has 4 pillars. We've got statistics and probability, all the types of modeling, well, linear, exponential, and logarithmic are the 3 main focus points. We do a whole chapter on financial math, so that's interest formulas, compound interest, loans, amortization, systematic savings, all the good stuff that students might actually use in their life. And the spine that sort of runs through the core of all of it is unit analysis. So this is the kind of unit conversions that students are going to need when they take other general ed courses like chemistry or astronomy. You know.
And there's a good healthy dose of problem solving strategies and problem solving abilities as we go through each of these topics as well, that gets a little bit of focus itself, but then becomes a common theme, just like the unit analysis, throughout each of the sections. And so in addition to those 4 pillars that we teach in all of our classes, there's usually just enough time that faculty members have some flexibility in picking additional topics that they may want to talk about. Things like fair division. How do you fairly divide land among siblings if they decide they don't want to sell grandpa's farm when he passes away? Or voting theory. How do you fairly count the elections that occur and the way that people are voting to actually represent what people want in the election process? Or how do you apportion the House of Representatives in the United States? And other such topics, as you can see here, that allow us to add some individuality to our courses. So no 2 courses are exactly the same, despite having those common themes, but also to give the students a chance to see math in context that they might not otherwise consider it to be in.
We have a question in the chat, John, about what textbook we use. John and I have both taught this course a number of times over the years using different textbooks from different publishers, but currently we've settled on the Viewing Life Mathematically, A Pathway to Quantitative Literacy by Denley and Hall, which is published by Hawkes.
And most of this is in there, although not everything is necessarily in there. So there is a lot of, when you do optional topics, there is a lot of development as well that occurs for the faculty. But there are plenty of resources out there for these optional topics as well.
Okay, so we wanted to talk about setting up groups. This information could be relevant to anyone using group work in any class. We kind of want to focus on the online environment, but feel free to use all of this stuff. So first of all, how do you assign groups within your class? Well, I suggest just do it randomly. It's probably as good as anything else. And if you let the students choose their own groups, it's going to work probably about as well as random anyway, except that you're going to get the 2 or 3 people who know each other are all going to want to be in the same group, which is fine, but that doesn't really lend itself well to a group dynamic. So probably better off to just start random and then make adjustments as you need to. Google did a 3-year study about what made effective teams. And one thing they discovered is that when each person in the group is contributing equally, that's what makes for the most effective team outcomes. And the core of this is psychological safety. Basically, people need to be not afraid to speak up, because if they're not afraid to say something, then they get the ideas out there. But if they're afraid of failure, they're not going to say anything unless they're absolutely certain. And this leads to a lot of group members saying very little at all. So
just coupled with that as well, a lot of times students are afraid of math classes because they're afraid of making mistakes in their math as well. So this also goes to the subject matter, to be able to let them bounce ideas off of each other, know that any idea is worth pursuing to some extent to see whether it actually works or not, which increases their ability to perform well inside of the math itself, the topic itself, the work itself that they're doing.
So we have a comment in the chat about using a learning diagnostic to place different styles together. And if you have that capability, that's great. If you have all the time and resources to curate your teams to bring in a mix of skills and abilities, fantastic. I don't typically find myself to have that time or capability at the beginning of a brand new math class, but if you do, use it.
Absolutely, and I have used that in the past. We piloted something that was developed. I piloted something that was developed here at UVU. Unfortunately, it wasn't as developed as it should have been, and so it ended up ultimately being random anyway. And so it depends on the tools you have and the resources you have. But if you have that, it can absolutely be a good way to help diversify the class.
Okay, we have another question in the chat, which is the perfect time to address. How would one do groups teaching this course via correspondence because of social distancing? So if you're teaching a correspondence course, you'll need to assign your students into groups one way or another. If you use a learning management system like Canvas, which is what Utah Valley uses, you can just assign the groups randomly within Canvas and then use that as a tool for getting the groups connected with each other. If you don't have a learning management system like that, then you'll need to probably communicate with them by email and maybe send a separate email to each group to let them, put them in touch with each other.
And a little bit later, we'll talk about platforms that can be used to facilitate conversation as well.
Yes. Okay, so what's the big complaint about groups? Students complain that they hate working in groups because they feel like someone just takes over and they don't get any input, or they feel like they end up doing all the work while the rest of the group just sits there and does nothing. So how do we establish psychological safety and prevent social loafing within groups in math classes? There's not a ton we can do, but there is some, and we're going to talk about it. Oh, a big question I always get from my students is, once you're in a group, are you in the same group through the whole semester? And everyone seems to want to ask this because they're terrified about what happens if I don't like my group members or my teammates. And the answer is, there's probably a lot about your teammates that you won't like and you won't get along with, but that doesn't really have any bearing, and the research backs me up on this, on whether or not your team will be effective as a team. And so clearly communicating this to your students at the beginning a good thing to do. Just let them know that you and your group members don't have to get along socially. You just have to work together, and you can produce good outcomes.
And it is, I also assure my students as well that if push really comes to shove, it is possible to rearrange groups in the middle of the semester. But this also leads directly into the next thing that we wanted to talk about, which is having each group form a group charter. And so here's an example of an assignment that I give students in electronic format. And this is the tail end of it for them to work through. And so there's actually a number of questions above it that they work through that talk about when do we meet, what's allowed at meetings, who's in charge, how do we meet, does it need to be in person, are telephone calls okay, all sorts of logistical questions to get them thinking about that group environment. And then other questions near the bottom here, you can see, for instance, the third question down, how does the group work with a member who is no longer contributing to the group? So you get the students talking about that ahead of time, get them to rationalize and think about this, and then they form this charter, this contract with each other and with me that allows for us to deal with those situations when they do come up.
And when students come to me complaining about what's going on in their group, it's very convenient to be able to say, okay, what does your group charter say about this? You can just point specifically. Will we share the PowerPoints after the webinar? Absolutely. We can share the PowerPoint, and I believe we can share the entire group charter document that John has written. You don't have to use it exactly as is. The specific details inside the group charter are not all that important. The important thing is that you have a group charter. Mm-hmm. And it is specifically important. There are two things that I say three things are pretty critically important. One is, how does the group communicate? Two, get everyone to sign it so that everyone in the group is bought in. And three, you need to address the exit clause. What would constitute someone being removed from the group, and how does that work?
Absolutely.
That's a problem.
I find that exit clause to be the ground that when I do have to move a student from one group to another, it ends up being the critical piece in how smooth that transition is and what the feelings are like between the members. I have seen arguments completely diffused when I went to the exit clause, and they ended up not actually using the exit clause and worked through the situation. But I've also been able to have them, and this isn't a class that met face-to-face because I use this contract with any group work that I do. But they could still be in the same room as each other and hold pleasant conversations, even though they were no longer in a group working together. Whereas situations I had before that, I had someone who left my class and never came back because of arguments they had with a group member. And so I find it helps a lot in that aspect.
I did want to mention that I've used group work in classes like this with a group charter and without a group charter, and it's definitely better with a group charter.
Yep.
So I've got that personal experience to draw on. All right, so the key question that I'm sure you're all wondering is, how do the students communicate? How do they collaborate online? Question in the chat. Thomas says, what about randomly reassigning the groups every week? This is entirely up to you. During COVID with physical distancing concerns, I wouldn't recommend it. If the students are working online, you could do this, but it turns into a hassle. And when students get communicating online, they start to imprint with their group. Even if their group is not necessarily people they like, they're people that they know. And they start to establish those relationships. And a semester is a very short amount of time to establish things like psychological safety within a group. So my recommendation is not changing groups every week. But if for whatever reason your class dynamic is friendly to it, go for it. You can do it.
And if you do want to mix it up throughout the semester, it's probably better done on a module basis than a weekly basis. So you have some units that are grouped together in some meaningful way. It can be a good way to mix it up maybe so that they can experience that working with diverse groups and different people in one course in one semester. But again, I echo Max. My experience has been that getting them into a group, getting that dynamic developed early on in the semester, helping them explore their roles can go a long way into making the later material, as it starts to get harder and more involved, deliberately, they're already comfortable working with each other and able to help approach those topics in very meaningful and useful ways because they already have the psychological safety of the group they're in.
Yeah, and one more point to add about that. At least one of the examples that we're going to go through is pretty good for a one-day in-class exercise. And if you want to do sort of mini group exercises or projects, this is more useful for people teaching live classes than online. You can certainly mix up the groups pretty easily. Just say, get into groups and let them do it. Yeah. Right. So, John, you want to talk about technology for a minute?
Absolutely. So this is actually one of my areas of interest and my areas of research is appropriate technologies, everything from LMSs to team-based tools. And so we've gone out and we've looked at, and we've used several of these tools before. So you can see on here, you have Microsoft Teams, which is the platform of choice here at UVU for a number of reasons. But you also have Google, either Google Classroom or just the Google platform with Hangouts and Pages and Docs and Sheets that is available. OneNote. Go ahead, sorry.
It's Google Meet now.
Google Meet now. Yeah, I haven't used Google in a long time. So thank you for adding that. Yeah. OneNote is a particularly interesting platform for collaboration, which I'll get into a little bit of details. I'm just outlining all these real quick, and I'll talk about my experiences with the ones that I have used. You have, of course, Zoom as a collaboration tool where you have meetings and video chats and different things like that. And of course, there's the age-old Facebook and the community that can develop around Facebook, even though that tends to be a lot more asynchronous than synchronous. And so, for instance, with Teams, I've used Teams now pretty much since COVID started in different ways, shapes, and forms. And it really works well as a single stop place to be able to have video chat meetings with your students, to be able to post files, to provide information, to get announcements out, to have one-on-one conversations. One of the things that I really like doing with it is creating smaller groups. So when I assign them to groups, they will get their own group channel that just they are in, so they can communicate with each other and not necessarily everyone else. And so that can help them focus on what they're doing. And one of the things that I've really appreciated about it is it provides a really good record of what the students are doing at any given time. So when they're meeting, even if they're in the chats, you know who's commenting when. You can follow their train of thought. They can follow their train of thought when they need to come back and look at something that they decided on as a group. With the video meetings, they have the ability to record those, even though I usually don't recommend that. That's up to them. I don't require that, and I wouldn't go through the videos if they were there necessarily unless they asked me to. But I would know who attended the meeting, who actually signed into the Teams and was there and was able to see what was going on. And so Teams.
John, we have a question.
Okay.
Which might fit in here well. Which platform allows for online groups to collaborate on the same document using mathematical equations?
All right, so that Teams you can a little bit, especially since as a Microsoft platform, Teams does have OneNote built into it. Or if you do Teams and set up as a class team, then there's a class notebook feature, and that allows all of them to be looking at the same document. They can all edit it at similar times, and OneNote itself actually has some really cool math features in it that would allow them to basically share their math, talk about their math. They can write it using the Word equation editor if they wanted, so it looks pretty, but it also has a built-in scientific calculator so that they can see both sides of the equation, what they typed in and what the result was. And so OneNote has that group capability as well, enabling that live synchronous looking at documents, being able to see the same thing, being able to see what other people are writing. Google does the same thing with Google Docs. You can have multiple people in a document at the same time, but I find doing math inside of the Google Docs to be a lot harder. It's just not as built and structured for that.
We have a couple of other related questions. If we're using Canvas, then why not use Canvas for all of this? That's a really good question.
That is a fantastic question. My first comment would be, and I'll let you weigh in too, Max, but my first comment would be that Canvas's built-in features for video meetings are really lacking and limited. The conference that is built into most instances of Canvas, I don't know if that's universal or if it's just the different universities that I've worked with in the past 7 years or so that happen to have it. And so if you want them to actually talk to each other over voice or audio or video, Canvas doesn't really provide that feature very well. And so it's nice to have a feature like that. As well, Canvas doesn't allow the same level of live editing that a lot of groups want, where they're talking on the phone and looking at the same document that you can get with Teams or with OneNote.
So I like to think of Canvas as a collection space or possibly an announcement space, but it's not where the actual work happens. It might be where the work gets submitted, and it might be where teams do planning about how they're going to work, but it doesn't tend to be the place where the actual work happens. Mm-hmm. We have lots of questions. Can the students use whether they have a Mac or a PC? I think all of these platforms work equally well on Mac and PC.
Every one of these platforms works equally well. Every one of these platforms works on every operating system. So OneNote in particular seems to have a penchant for working better on a PC than it does on a Macintosh, but not to the level that your students are probably going to notice. It's more of a power user thing that doesn't have all of the features because it's not as fully developed. So OneNote isn't quite as friendly, but it still works just fine.
2 more questions real quick, and then we can talk a little bit more. But these questions actually guide our discussion in a really good way. Group work implies 1 grade to all the group members. If so, how do you deal with the group member who didn't participate at all? In the cases of this for me have been pretty rare, but if there's a case where a group member is genuinely not contributing, I try to get the team to come to me about that early, and sometimes I will remove them from the group. But again, you can point to the group charter about this. To answer your question, yes. In my classes, group work does mean 1 grade for all the students in each group. They submit 1 project, I grade that project, and then all of the students get that grade. I hope that they've collaborated equally, and I hope that I've guided them in a way that would allow them to collaborate equally, but there's no pure guarantee that that's happening.
I would like to add that I was struggling with this a little bit more than Max was, and one of the tactics that I chose to do was that for some of my projects, because there are times that there are parts of the project that I want everyone to know how to do. There's some mathematical operation that I want them to do. I want everyone to, for instance, find a home that has a listing price and calculate what their monthly payments would be if they were to try and find a loan today to get that home. So they have to look up bank rates, they have to know the formula. And so one thing that I have done for projects is developed an individual portion and a group portion for the assignment. And so every individual has to do the individual portion, and only those individuals who do will also get the points on the group portion as well. It's a lot harder to set up inside of Canvas. It is possible, but the rubrics don't translate from student to student. You can't copy another student's rubric. You have to enter them all in differently. So it's a lot more work up front to do something like that, and a lot more work on the back end when you're actually grading. But I have found that that has helped mitigate the social loafing when they know that there's both an individual and a group portion for the project.
Okay, we have a comment. Collaborations in Canvas allows for simultaneous editing of files. I didn't know that.
I did not know that either. That's
awesome. We have another question about working in Linux environments. I honestly don't know. I think that's just going to have to be beyond the scope of this presentation.
Yeah, I also, if you have these apps in Linux, then I imagine that they will work, and I would be hard pressed to believe that there's not some version of them, but whether it's the most up-to-date one or not is, I don't know.
So let's see. How do students have access to Teams and Notes? Are there extra costs for students? Potentially. As it happens at Utah Valley University, part of their student fees buys them access to the entire Microsoft Office suite. So our students have access to Teams just as part of being students. If that's the case at your institution, then you can sort of make the students use whatever you want. the Google services, Google Drive, Google Sheets, Google Docs, that collaboration tool is free, and the students could use that if you want a free option. Although there are some pitfalls with that one that we'll talk about a little bit later. Did you do any study to know how much the group work added to the students' learning and performance? I've looked into some studies about that, but I haven't done any myself.
And the assessment that we do on the class is at the individual level, not at the group level at present. We don't have anything to assess whether the group had an impact on it or not.
Yeah, and while I haven't assessed that directly in any scientific way, anecdotally, I can say that the classes where I use group work, the final exam outcomes tend to be pretty good. So it seems like it's working so far. I'm really bought into the idea of getting students working in groups because I think that that's a skill that they're going to need outside of college. And I hope that they're learning math along the way. But I got to be honest, it's worth it simply for the ease in grading, especially if I'm having students write papers or essays, which often I do, surprisingly, in math classes. It's really nice to have to read 7 5-page essays instead of 35 if I've got them working in groups. So
I agree with that.
Have I used the shared whiteboard in the groups? Shared whiteboards are coming along, but they're not perfect yet. Teams either has one or is developing one. OneNote is kind of like a shared whiteboard, except it's not so much with writing with your hands.
It is if you have a tablet and a stylus.
Right.
But
Right.
for a normal desktop, it's not really a whiteboard.
Yes. Let's see. You noticed in OneNote they have a calculator that shows you how to do the mechanics, math such as the steps of solving an equation.
I haven't really played with that feature. It's the Math Inc. program, which I find to be a little. When I used it a couple of years ago, I found it to be a little bit buggy. I assume that's what you're talking about. I just primarily use it the built-in scientific calculator from OneNote, and have my students do so as well.
Yeah. Some of these are going so fast that I can't see them, but MyScript Math is an add-in for MS Word, which allows you to use the mouse to draw an equation. Okay. And have it typeset. Great. Amy says she's used group work for a very long time and her students tend to do better in class than other instructors, but you've never done it online, so it should be interesting. Yeah, indeed. Same. Well, okay, not exactly same.
I would say that I did start face-to-face as well and then adapt to what I did there in the online environment. And I have had mixed feelings from students, and a lot of it has to do with the biggest change was the group charter. That made the biggest impact once even the online groups decided how they were going to work as groups. That made it better. But also being deliberate in the way I communicate about how I expect them to work in groups makes a big difference as well. So being fun about that.
Sorry to interrupt. Mary says, are students feeling overwhelmed by all the technology tools they need to use in their classes? Are our students from rural areas? Are our students from rural areas that impair their ability to stay online? How do we deal with low bandwidth areas? I'm feeling overwhelmed with all the technologies that we're rolling out at our university to teach during the pandemic. So I have to imagine that our students are feeling that as well.
I definitely know that they are. I use a lot more technology than Max does. I force my students to learn Excel. I force my students to get involved in OneNote and some other features as well. I try really, really, really hard in both my syllabus and at the beginning of the semester to make that clear to them up front. And then I actually dedicate time to each tool that I use that I'm not even getting into the math content yet, just to give them a chance to explore, experiment. And yes, I can definitely say they feel overwhelmed. I have also had non-traditional students come back to me and tell me that they're now using it in their regular lives as well. Like if they can get past that fear and start using it and you help them address that, I have seen them embrace it, even the ones that I thought wouldn't.
Yes, and I can speak very highly about the introduction to the technology, especially for Excel and OneNote. If you're going to use OneNote in your classes, having a module or an assignment that introduces the students to it directly and gives some tips about how to use it will, and give credit for those assignments. That would be tremendously helpful. We have a YouTube video describing how to get Office for free. Okay, great.
That's cool.
You have your students learn Excel and learning statistics. Yes.
That's one of the, that and financial math are the two reasons I push Excel.
Could we describe in more detail how we use the group charter? Do we have all students sign it at the start of a semester? What happens if a student does not sign? Okay, good question. Yes, I'm a little nervous about how I'm going to do it this semester, but I suppose they can collaborate with it online. Do all students sign it like physically with a pen and ink signature? No, not necessarily. They can type their name into it.
Yeah.
The way I tend to deal with this, or the way I intend to deal with this this semester, is I'll have my students work out the group charter virtually, however they do. Maybe they meet in a virtual meeting and they talk about their answers to the questions and get everything in place, and then they say, okay, we're all ready, we're bought in, and then they all type their names at the bottom and they sign it. And you could do this in something like OneNote or Google Docs, or you could even email around a Word file and have everyone put their name in, or you could even have a scribe say, okay, Joe's in, Amy's in, Melissa's in, you know, everybody's in. And if we have a student who doesn't sign, I would talk to that student. To be honest, that's never happened.
Right.
I've never had a group that couldn't come up with a charter that they could all sign. But if I had a student that wouldn't sign, I mean, an easy solution is to put that student in another group if you can find one, put that student in a group by themselves. I don't like to do this option because it sort of defeats the purpose of group work for that student as a learning opportunity, but I could do it.
But it is an option.
But yeah, that's a great question.
And just on that, I actually make it an assignment that's worth points, that they get the points just for completing it, not for the content. And that's made clear to them when they are filling it out.
Okay, we have a couple of questions that I wanted to address. The issue about rural students with low bandwidth, that's a tough social justice issue that bears a lot of attention and ultimately probably goes beyond the scope of this presentation. I will say that in order for group work to function really well online, video meetings are way better than audio meetings, but audio meetings are way better than just a shared email thread.
Or even a chat feature.
Yeah. And how does the group charter play out for underrepresented minority students, especially the exit clause? Are they negatively affected at higher rates?
No, I haven't found that to be the case. I don't think that we necessarily have the same environment that would play out as well in, though.
Candidly speaking, the student population at Utah Valley University is pretty homogenous and very largely white. But this is something that we think about, and inclusivity is one of our core values as an institution. So one thing I do to help guide that process is an inclusivity statement in my syllabus. But that is a great question and worthy of some further thought.
And I do look at their exit clauses deliberately with that eye, including I've reached out to, in one case where I was a little bit worried about it, I reached out to a fellow professor who is himself a minority to look at it and got his feedback and input before I provided feedback to the group. So I haven't seen it have any increased, but also as Max said, there also isn't, that tension isn't as visible as it probably should be here.
So one last thing to address, have we used a shared whiteboard in groups? Probably the closest thing that I've used is OneNote to a shared whiteboard. I hope that really usable shared whiteboards are coming in apps like Zoom and Microsoft Teams, and I think they will be. They haven't been yet, and the most experience I have with whiteboards is my cheesy setup for when I make online video content, where I have a whiteboard app on my iPad, and then I have another app that shares my iPad screen to my computer, and then I can make a video and write that way. But it's, the technology is a little bit behind the need right now. Okay, so Judy says, you researched free Wi-Fi in your county and shared that with your students. All county libraries have free Wi-Fi, and you can get that in their parking lots. That's awesome. That's an awesome solution. I mean, it's not ideal, obviously, but it's worth considering, certainly.
Right.
BitPaper gives students shared whiteboard space. Okay, I'm going to make a note about that because I haven't heard of that software, but I'm always interested in more. BitPaper. Thank you.
We probably ought to address one more question and move on to some of our examples.
Sure. Oh, Zoom has a shared whiteboard option. Blackboard Collaborate has a shared whiteboard option. Okay, good. Yeah. This is good to hear. Is it possible to add your iPad as a co-host and share? I haven't explored that option with Zoom. Google has Jamboard. Okay.
I know that you can in Teams. It's a little bit clunky, but it can be done.
Yeah, and I'll jump in there. It is possible. So you could just join the Zoom meeting from your iPad and have it listed as the co-host.
Fantastic.
Yep.
I'm happy to know that we're catching up there. That's good. Should we dive into some examples?
We're right up to the examples. So
keep the technology questions coming, because we wanted to use these examples as a means of saying, how do students collaborate online to do, group projects like these? And you could maybe, you can use these projects if you want to. You could maybe think about how these projects are like the projects you want to use, and how you can collaborate with those as well. All right, so I'll take this one. This project was written by a colleague of ours, and I love this project. It has a fantastic payoff, and it really makes a good one-day project in class if you want to use it that way, but it can also be a project that students collaborate online about. So you want to pour concrete for a slab that has this weird shape where it's got like a rectangle and then a quarter circle at the top of it. And you've got some information about the costs of concrete, the increments in which you can order it, and a schedule for how much the delivery is going to cost depending on how much you order. And so this project has lots of different moving pieces that a group can really attack. There's the problem of, okay, we need to probably deal with converting feet to inches or vice versa, because the dimensions of this slab are given in feet, but the thickness is given in inches. So we have to think about that. We have to think about deep unit analysis to get everything into cubic yards. And then we have to look at the cost. And I'm just going to give the punchline so that we can really address what the payoff is. The students should get an answer that is a volume somewhere in between 5 3/4 and 6 yards. And the payoff here is that if they order exactly the amount of concrete that they need, they actually pay more than if they just order 6 cubic yards. And so now you can get groups talking, and you can sort of guide them with hints, but you can say, take a close look at the delivery fee schedule. Some students might say, well, we want to round it up to 6 anyway, because what happens if some of it is bad, or if we end up with, when you do a project like this, you often want to have a little bit extra. That's just common sense in construction. And so the math provides a great opportunity for collaboration, but then once you get beyond the math, once you get to the answer, you get to have a conversation about, is this answer really the answer? And that's what I think makes this a great project. John, did you have anything to add?
Well, I was going to point out that actually the amount comes out to just under 5 3/4.
Oh, does it? Okay.
So that when you round up, it doesn't default to the free one.
Right, right.
We usually give them a hint. I've done this, I know Max has done this, where we say, if the delivery fee does not impact your decision, you've made your calculations wrong.
Right. I love that hint. Okay, so how do students benefit from working in a group on this kind of a project? Well, they have more eyes. So, for example, someone is going to notice that they need to convert feet to inches. And in that moment, that person's going to be a hero. But now all of the group is on the right track. So you get those kinds of opportunities. More students also means it's more likely that someone's going to notice this secret hidden cost advantage from ordering extra concrete. And this project in particular makes it really good for them to make a plan. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to figure out the volume. Once we have the volume, we need to use that to figure out the cost. Once we have the cost, we need to talk about what any other considerations there might be. So.
And that gets them in line with the way that a lot of work is apportioned with groups that they're going to do in their jobs later, where they have a plan and they have to follow it through and they have to work together to help get that done. One of the things about this project that's kind of fun is it's a good one to let the students break up who's doing what, which is something that often happens in real group work assignments. And so it allows them that opportunity to have that plan, to figure out problem-solving strategies, and to follow through with their work. And so
we have another suggestion in the chat about an interactive whiteboard called whiteboard.fi. I made a note so I can check it out. Thank
awesome.
you. Okay, let's see. One question. Oh, from Marcia. Hi, Marcia. Is there any way to get them to work together instead of have someone do all the work and then just tell the group?
Absolutely.
Is there a way to guide it so that they are more likely? Yes. Is there a way to guarantee it? Not necessarily. I mean, if they're doing the work virtually.
Especially in the online groups.
I will make another plug for OneNote in this regard, because OneNote does allow you as the host, is that what you call it in OneNote?
Yeah.
The coordinator.
Coordinator.
To see who has made what collaborations.
And in fact, it does for everybody, but
yeah.
usually only us as the instructors really pay attention to it. The students don't realize what we're talking about when we say that often. Is there another question?
Yeah, there is one more. Your students tend to prefer their own ways of communicating and collaborating, i.e. text, Google Docs, which you can't access, other things. And it seems like a deliberate effort to hide the work from you as the instructor.
I haven't personally run into that, mostly because the projects themselves are due, like I make them submit them through OneNote. So they do all their work already in OneNote. In fact, I find that they do more work in OneNote when working in groups than otherwise. Like things that I don't expect them to necessarily put into OneNote, they end up putting in there. So I found the opposite, but I could see it happening.
One other suggestion, because I honestly do like the idea of letting students collaborate on their own terms. I think that's worthwhile. And I think they may be more likely to collaborate better if they're doing it the way that they want to do it. I often request a summary, and you can make this a separate assignment. You can give it 4 credit, or you can just make it part of the project itself. Just say, at the end, I need a summary of who did what. And if the students then have a steamroller who's doing all the work and everyone else is just loafing, then they have to decide whether they're going to fess up to this or lie. And honestly, I find students on the whole to be pretty honest. So if they know that they're going to have to be accountable for what they did, they're going to want to step up and do it. So that's one suggestion.
We ready for the next project?
Yeah, let's go for it.
This one's a favorite of mine.
CatMeet is a suggestion for online collaboration. I haven't heard of that one. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
All right, so this one's a favorite one of mine. One of the optional sections that we teach is apportionment. And of course, the classic example is the House of Representatives and how it divides up the House of Representatives amongst the states based on population. How do you do that fairly? Especially since very rarely do you see a state you can't give a decimal seat out, right? You can't split a seat between Delaware and Florida. It has to be a whole seat for a state. And so this is one that the Excel file is already created, The green cells are the places that the students get to do the information, and you can see different methods here for apportioning the states. But the point of this project is to get them to actually take current data, the current census data, and the yearly projections, even though that's not how the Senate does it, or the House does it, they don't rearrange, they only rearrange with the census. But to do it with the current data, and then to look for trends and patterns and different elements of it that allow them to get a better feel for the way that the apportionment happens. And so they get an Excel file that they have to fill out, and then they get together and answer some questions related to what they found.
Yeah, I love this project. You can notice here the Florida column is probably the most interesting on this
section
screenshot. But you'll notice that Florida apportions wildly different amounts. I mean, I guess they're only different by one, but that's pretty different when you're talking about a seat in Congress.
Mm-hmm.
The Hamilton method gives 28, Jefferson's method gives 29.
Adams
gives 27, and the Huntington Hill method, which is what we currently use, gives back to 28. So you can get students talking about why do these different methods apportion different amounts when the state has the same population, regardless of how you're apportioning. So this project does have two parts to it, right? There's, well, I guess three if you count. You need to get the census data from the website. And I love the idea that they have to go out and find this data set themselves. I give them some pretty specific instructions for how to do it. And I would recommend that if you're going to use this project, because the census website is kind of a nightmare. But they have to go get that data. They have to import it into the spreadsheet. And then they have to massage the methods to make sure that the apportionment is correct.
And then they have to compare the results.
Right. And so they get this chance to use technology to draw inferences from a large data set. And then they get to talk about the historical implications of why are these numbers different under these different methods and what led to the method that we use today. Mm-hmm. It's a really great project.
And so just some of the benefits that they have is it's another good one to practice splitting up work, that they can assign out pieces of the project, because it can be very overwhelming for the students. And so by learning how to divide work up appropriately, it can really help them understand how to do that with other projects that they're going to see in their own work. They also gain a mathematical perspective on history that is not otherwise talked about, even in history classes or American Civ classes. And again, we're back to what we saw in the earlier one, where having more eyes on the data brings more information to light than a single person can gain. They're able to identify things and bounce ideas off of things in ways that individuals can't always do. And it may be one of the only times in their life that these particular students are going to look at large data to draw inferences and conclusions.
Can we take a quick second to catch up on some questions, and then we'll look at our final example?
Yep.
So we had a question about, can we send this project for use for probability and statistics? Absolutely. Perhaps the best way to do this is for us to send all of the relevant materials to Megan and Sarah, and then anyone who wants them can request them that way. We can also provide our personal contact information, but there's a lot to keep track of while we're presenting to so many people. So yeah, yes is the answer. We can absolutely get all of this stuff into your hands. Okay, let's see, did we have any more?
I thought there were a
couple.
couple.
We had a comment in the chat about making students in a group grade each other. I love that suggestion. I haven't ever used it myself, honestly, because I've been a little bit scared to, but it's a great way to keep everyone honest. Mm-hmm. And you can even let them grade each other. Well, you would need to be able to see who graded who, but you don't have to let them see.
Yeah, make it anonymous.
You can make it anonymous as far as they're concerned. So.
Other questions that you want to address at this point, Max?
let's see, you have a colleague who's doing this kind of work, requires the student to submit notes from all communications and collaborations into the Canvas forum associated. Yeah, that's a great suggestion.
If you're using a platform like Teams, a lot of that could be automatically captured within Teams too.
You love this example. It's unusual in your experience, but so real world. Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
I was immediately drawn to that project. And I honestly, the timing of it was really good because Hamilton was still pretty new when we started using this project, and you get to talk about Alexander Hamilton and the rivalry with Jefferson, and you get to do it all in the context of apportionment. And, I like to make a joke that they were having rap battles about this on the floor of the Senate.
It also hit right in the 2016 national conventions.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of interesting things that happened when we were developing this.
Absolutely.
You ready for the next one, Max?
Yeah, let's do it. Okay, so I like to assign my students a project about the prisoner's dilemma. Now, the overarching theme of this project is the concept of expected value. But I love to put it in the context of the prisoner's dilemma because I think the prisoner's dilemma is such a great example, and it's never been more relevant for me than it is right now during the pandemic. So just in case you haven't heard the prisoner's dilemma before, let's do a brief rundown of the scenario. You and your partner are going to rob a bank, your partner in crime. The police catch you casing the joint. You're there at the bank, it's clear to them that you're looking, you're trying to decide where the cameras are and where the security guards stand, and they get you into the back of a police car. They separate you, they take you to the police station, and you presumably now know the following setup. If you confess and your partner stays quiet, you go free and they get 20 years in prison. If you both confess, you both get 10 years. And if you both keep your mouths shut, then you only get 6 months for loitering because they can't prove that you were conspiring at that point. So you can start with the setup. You can have a conversation with your students about what's objectively the best option here for everybody. And usually the students can agree that if you both stay quiet, you both only serve 6 months. That's way better than either of you going away for 10 years. And so I like to ask them some questions about what's the best option here, and then how does that guide your strategy? But then I like to say, okay, now let's put this in the context of expected value. So I want to play around with giving them even more cases, but historically I've given them the following 2 cases. Case 1, assume your partner is 50% likely to confess. Then compute the relative expected prison lengths for the strategies of confessing and staying quiet, respectively. So let's show those numbers. So if you confess, it turns out that your expected prison length is 5 years. If your partner is equally likely to confess or stay quiet. And the strategy of staying quiet then gets you an expected prison stay of 10.25 years. And so this is a good opportunity for them to notice that expected value doesn't necessarily have to be a positive, or excuse me, a possible outcome. Mm-hmm. It's just a guideline for how to assess the situation. In case 2, assume that your partner is 80% likely to confess. Now the numbers come out a lot higher. Confessing now gives you an expected prison stay of 8 years, and staying quiet gives you an expected prison stay of 16.1 years. Yikes. Okay, so let's go through some takeaways for this project, and then we'll get to as many questions as we can while we still have time. I love that the students get to discuss philosophy and game theory, and I don't even really use those words or phrases. I don't talk a whole lot about philosophy. I definitely don't use the word game theory, even though that's exactly what the students are talking about. They get to use their calculations as a guide for decision making. They get to have fun with it. They get to play. They get to talk about robbing a bank, which is exciting. And, of course, I always say in my classes, now I know that, of course, none of you would ever actually rob a bank. However, come with me on this hypothetical journey. I love that having lots of brains on this produce lots of creative answers. And I absolutely love it when the students bring up what I like to call the snitches get stitches clause. At the end of the project, I like to ask them, is there anything else you would consider beyond the calculations? And often they say, well, people who are known to confess have a bad reputation in prison. I don't want to go to prison and get beat up, so I'm not gonna be a rat. And that's a valid consideration.
In fact, it plays into the expected value calculations if you can really put numbers to it. But that's usually beyond the scope of what we're trying to do with these students.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for the group that actually decides to massage the numbers on their own and incorporate snitches get stitches quantitatively into their calculations. But I'm pretty sure the first group who does that is going to get some extra credit. Okay, let's look at some questions. How can we differentiate this assignment for students with learning disabilities? That's a very complicated question. If you're talking about the apportionment project with the spreadsheet, Excel is pretty accessible and getting better all the time. So you've got that tool on your side. But that's a very complicated question that, fortunately for me, I haven't had to deal with too extensively. But again, you know, this ties in with the underrepresented groups question. All of these social justice and inclusivity issues are going to be really important considerations as more teaching goes online.
Yes.
How long does the apportionment project usually take?
I usually assign it and give them either a week or a 2-week period to do it. And that seems to be sufficient.
Yeah, that's about what I do. And I suggest that if they were to sit down, they could probably get the whole thing done in 4 hours.
Mm-hmm.
But that would require 4 hours of dedicated work as a group, and they would probably need to all be together for that. So I encourage them to have, you know, multiple 1 or 2 hour meetings over the course of a week or two, and that's usually enough time. If one sets up Canvas groups in a random way, is there a way to import these groups into Teams?
I'll tackle that one. Importing, I haven't seen. Teams seems to be really resilient against loading lists of students. It can be done manually, and I'm sure that your academic IT support team may have better ways of being able to help you, or even have someone who can help do it for you. But Teams itself is really resilient to loading lists to create groups and subgroups.
Marcia makes a really good point in the chat about seeing students being extremely compassionate and understanding of their respective disabilities. And I love to see that. I have seen that a little bit with my students. When you get to watch them support their relative strengths and weaknesses and lean on each other when they need to and support each other when they can, it's really special to see that come together.
Yeah.
It may even be worth recommending that they put something like that in their group charter. What does involvement look or sound like in your courses? How do you engage with the online group, check-ins, etc.? So that's a really good question from Sydney. Like, how do we check in with groups in an online setting? Do you have any suggestions, Sean?
Yeah, I do regular checkups. I have regular assignments that they report on how things are going. I have optional online office hours that students can sign up for, which I schedule the times according to what they ask for. I also just send Canvas messages to students on a regular basis just to check in and see how they're doing. And with one exception in my entire going on 12 years of teaching now, 13 years of teaching now, I've only had one student who was offended by that. More often than not, they're grateful, they're helpful. I especially watch and send messages to students who vanish just to see what's going on. They're no longer contributing any work. Their group reports that they're missing. I'll reach out to them. On occasion, I have actually looked up their phone numbers and called them. But you kind of have to play it by ear and see what your students are comfortable with as well. But when they know that I care about how they're doing, not just as students, but as individuals, making sure that, hey, you vanished, what's going on in your life, how can I help? they open up, and I see them respond and still find ways to succeed in the class despite missing periods of time sometimes.
In the before times, I used to tell students to come as a group to my office hours, and occasionally they would do that. And, you know, then they would have me there to sort of guide them along. Now I would probably just make myself available to meet with them virtually. If they want to meet through Teams or whatever their platform is, I can do that. It could be a little time intensive, but it's worthwhile. Ben Moulton says, a lot of neurodiverse students will actually thrive in this environment more so than they would in a face-to-face class. I've seen that happen. I've seen that come about. And in fact, specifically with the apportionment project, it's great to see students dividing that work. Like, okay, you guys get the spreadsheet done, then you come to us and we can talk about your results together, and then we can make a plan as a team for how we're going to answer the questions, but then the other half of the group is going to do the write-up. And then they all meet back again and sort of sign off on everything. Mm-hmm. And it's such a great project in that way to split up the relative strengths and weaknesses of the group members. Thank you, Dr. Adams. Yes, it is complicated. Judy says, how do your students work on the prisoner's dilemma outside of class or in class? How much time is usually needed? So I often like to introduce the topic of expected value in class, give the students a really good idea of how to compute expected values, and I may even do one example from the project, possibly with a different likelihood, you know, do 40-60 instead of 80-20 or 50-50, and just show them how it works mechanically. And then I let them do it outside of class. And I would say that most groups spend about 2 hours altogether on that project. That's my guess. I mean, once they actually see the pattern, mm-hmm. answering the questions from there is pretty straightforward. Are we missing anything, John?
I do want to comment that it is 3 o'clock right now. So just before we go.
Okay, this is a good question to end on. How many students are in our classes and how many are in each group? We could have mentioned this at the beginning. That might have been a good idea. Yeah. But our classes tend to have about 30 students, and I tend to divide them into groups of 4 or 5. But that's what works for me. I mean, you could do a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller, but the research about effective teams suggests that not too much. 2 is too few, and definitely more than 10 is way too many. But in a context like this, I'd say even 7 is too many. I would cap the groups out at about 6.
Agreed.
Have I assigned a shared project with a subject in a different department? I started working with a colleague in English. We were going to talk about apportionment on the math side, and he was going to talk about it on the English and research paper side. That collaboration fell through, but I totally would love to do that in the future. That's a great question. Thank you. Okay, sorry, I answered one more than I was supposed to.
You're good.
That's okay. Thank you so much, John and Max, for all the information you gave. That was fantastic. And thank you everyone for attending and for your time today. If you all have any more questions, please feel free to direct them to us at marketing@hawkslearning.com, and we will compile them for John and Max. And we'll also be emailing you a link to this webinar on demand shortly, and you can view the webinar as well as past or future webinars on our blog at blog.hawkslearning.com. I hope everyone has a fantastic weekend.
Thank you all for being here. This was really a pleasure.
Thank you.